Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Each week, Dr. Crosby interviews a fascinating new guest on a range of compelling topics, from literature to psychology to financial wellness. To learn more about Dr. Crosby's behavioral finance work at Orion, visit www.orion.com.
Hey, Standard Deviations listeners, did you know that you could be receiving continuing education credit for listening to certain podcast episodes? That's right. There are continuing education credits available for CFP board advisors, along with CMAs, CPWAs, and RMAs for certain episodes. The Advisor Academy is Orion's free, continuing education platform for advisors where you can get CE credits on the go. The platform offers a handful of podcast episodes that you can either listen to or watch and receive CE credit. Check the podcast description for more details or visit orionadvisorakademy.myabsorb.com and use code PODCASTS, that's podcast with an S, to sign up. Note, not all podcast episodes qualify for CE credit. You must listen or watch through the Orion Advisor Academy to receive the credit. Visit orion.com/advisor-academy to learn more. Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I'm joined by Adam Tolliver, CFP, a financial advisor with a decade of experience serving business owners in Atlanta. He is the world's biggest Florida State University fan. I made him turn his video off because he had a big national championship poster up there when they beat my boys, the Auburn Tigers. He is the community involved. He's the past board chair of the Atlanta Smart Academy, serving middle school students in Southwest Atlanta. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm really excited to be here. Looking forward to it. Love your show. Love what you do.
Well, you've been a good friend for many years now. It's wonderful to have you on here to share some of your expertise. This week, we had the Conference for African American Financial Professionals right here in Atlanta, and that very conference has sparked our conversation today. We're going to be talking about the racial wealth gap. Adam, I know you're an expert in these things. To kick off our conversation, can you give us a sense of the size of the problem and the scope of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, there are all types of stats that you can run down, and they're sobering every time you hear them. But, you know, some of the highlights is for every dollar the average white American has, the average Black American has 17 cents. Black Americans hold 60% of their wealth, 66% of their wealth in their homes, and are much less likely to hold stocks, with 34% of Black households owning equity investments versus 61% of white households. And the average value of those holdings are 25% less than their peers. White households are almost 3 times as likely as Black households to inherit any wealth. And the size of that wealth is estimated over 5 times as much as Black households. And then, one famous benchmark study that came out in 2016 estimated that it would take African American families 228 years for catching up to the white household current wealth in 2016. So the magnitude of the issue is pretty overwhelming. And so much so that, you know, as a financial advisor, as someone who works with people directly with their money and is often speaking in front of the community and to the community in sort of one-to-many type of scenarios, I'm very, very cautious and intentional about telling people that, you know, your personal financial success is not going to close the racial wealth gap. So, you know, the work that we do together, that's not the solve. But what it can do is we can create some intentionality in planning and follow through so that you can change your individual household and your family's trajectory to create a sort of persisting new normal around wealth and how you and your family manage what you have.
Yeah, you weren't lying when you said those were sobering statistics. I mean, that 200 plus year catch-up gap is incredible. The 17 cents on the dollar. I mean, these are sobering statistics. And, by some measures, I've actually seen sometimes Los Angeles, sometimes Atlanta being named as the city in the U.S. with the greatest wealth inequality. I mean, you and I both know that Atlanta is a place with, a great deal of wealth and a great deal of want. When we try and think through these stats, I have, at least in my head, I have attributed them to historical factors, systemic discrimination, things like redlining. Is that what you see as the genesis of these differences? To what would you attribute them? And do financial advisors have a role in addressing these inequalities?
Yeah, so it's the culmination of many of those systemic issues, many of which were, you mentioned something like redlining, which I think is probably one of the largest and most classic examples. When we think about redlining, that's a situation where the Federal Housing Authority itself really was influential in carrying out the systematic inequality that took place over essentially 3 generations of what would have been Black homeowners. And for those who don't know what redlining is, just because I don't want to take that for granted, it's essentially where certain areas within neighborhoods and cities across the country, red lines were drew around those communities to suppress or essentially label them as neighborhoods or communities that were not worthy of investment, and they were drawn based on the Black population in those areas. And so, as you can imagine, over time, a couple of things happened. One is that the value of the homes in those areas was suppressed in comparison to the value of those homes outside of the area. The other thing is, when new homeowners wanted to borrow and purchase homes, they were not able to secure funding or lending for areas outside of those redlined areas. So you create this double effect, this double impact, and really that tends to be a theme throughout the years with systemic racism, and especially as it pertains to the racial wealth gap, because even when we discuss redlining, which I think as described here, we've established pretty terrible, right? If we think about things like the GI Bill, which created a plus benefit to incentivize or help, and really in many ways helped create the middle class in America over the last 60 years, things like that were where Black veterans and their families were really excluded from the benefit of the GI Bill. So you imagine the compounding effect of not getting the GI Bill and being restricted along redlining. Those types of things do have a sort of precipitous impact over time. And that's part of why those stats that we hear now are so sobering. It's because they are the cumulative effect of generations of these types of policies and practices being normalized. And they're kind of self-perpetuating. It's like, look at the results, and then the results kind of justify and reinforce a lot of the sort of stereotypes and opinions that people have of the ability or inability of a community to generate its own wealth. And so that's a lot that I just said, but your question came back to what is the role of financial advisors who serve the Black community in helping. And, again, I'm sensitive to the fact that there is no amount of advice, despite how confident I am in my training, how good I feel about how well I can do my job and how valuable I am to my clients. There's no amount of training that I have. There's no advice that I can give that can solve that problem. But the value that I bring and that those in my profession can bring when we are competent and engaged and we care about our clients is we can help bring sort of the personal context to how do these facts impact you and your family, not just in your house, but your extended family. And I can kind of go into better detail about how the macro impacts the micro in just a second. But helping to bring the magnitude of a problem that large down to size so that we can talk about the practical ways in which an individual household can impact its own financial journey, its own wealth story.
You brought up 2 points there, one of which I had never considered at all, and one which was just driven home forcefully to me. The first was just the way that wealth works over time is that it compounds.
Exactly.
If it's well managed, it grows and it snowballs in a rather dramatic way. Right? Mm-hmm. That is just what money does if it's well taken care of. So at any point in time, if there is a systemic injustice that keeps one group of people from fully participating in the American economic miracle, the impact of that injustice on subsequent generations is compounded the same way that the money itself compounds. And then the thing that I had never considered was just the way that redlining sort of reified existing stereotypes. Like you redline an area, you say that it's not fit for investment. So then it falls into disrepair, it becomes impoverished, it may, and then all the things that accompany poverty, crime, disrepair, all the other stuff comes and you go, well, see, told you.
Exactly.
This wasn't a nice place. So it's really, these injustices really, really do compound and become self-perpetuating, I think, in a powerfully negative way. It's easy to look at things like this as a historical relic, but I don't want to fall into that trap. It's easy to look back at the past and go, wow, they didn't get it, how backwards of them. What sort of systemic inequities and injustices are we up against today, and what fight remains to be fought today?
A lot of the systemic inequities that exist today and that are particularly relevant to the racial wealth gap really are around the same areas. They deal with housing, they deal with education, access to education, and sort of the remnants of those past policies and injustices and the impact on public education and the disparity in public education by counties, neighborhoods, states, and zones are very much all tied to redlining. You think about the tax base that serves a certain area and how much of that is impacted by property taxes. And if you can follow the through line between suppressing the value of a home or homes in a community and what impact that has on the school district around it over time, as you mentioned, everything that comes with that kind of flows downhill. But then on the other side of it, you've got the private sector, corporate sector's impact. So large banks within even recent years have been caught and successfully sued, found guilty of subprime mortgage lending based on race. Job discrimination continues to be an issue. So when we have studies from the American Bar Association showing the discrepancy in callbacks based on the way names sound on resumes or appear to read on resumes. These are the types of things, you mentioned Los Angeles and Atlanta and the types of cities that have these huge disparities in wealth. And I want to point out that there's also a huge disparity in income. And sometimes people use the income gap and the wealth gap interchangeably, but wealth disparity and income disparity are two separate but complementary things. So I like to make sure that people understand that pre-existing wealth insulates income. So even if we solved the income issue, right? So if we took two people, different races, and gave them the exact same income, if one of them has some pre-existing wealth and the other does not, then their outcomes are going to be very different. Your income really serves the purpose of meeting your immediate needs. And I like to separate these out through your immediate needs are met through, that's very much a utility thing. Like, this is the use of my current dollars. Today, I need to pay for my housing. I need to pay for food, clothes. I need to feed my family. I need to pay for my day-to-day activity, my lifestyle, etc. But at some point, you meet in your income, you meet the point where your utility is met. All of the bills that you need to pay are paid. And then you're making decisions about some future self, right? And your future self has needs as well, but you've also gotten to a point where you have a bit of discernment about what to do with those dollars. So you move from utility to discernment. And if you have pre-existing wealth, you get to discernment a lot quicker. And so income inequality and wealth inequality are two different things. They're two different beasts that feed each other. And it's important to really make sure that when we're looking at systemic issues, we aren't looking at them in sort of an acute vacuum, like what's happening today, because there are things happening today still: the job discrimination, lending discrimination, housing disparities, healthcare, education disparities. But like you mentioned earlier, it's the cumulative effect of these things over multiple generations. And why I bring up income inequality and how income is insulated by pre-existing wealth, even if we solve for that issue. So if it appears that, someone is doing really well today, if their family doesn't have the pre-existing wealth, or if that individual person that you see doing really well is sort of an outlier in their family from an income perspective, they may be kind of called on or responsible for multiple households because no one else in their family has that type of income and there is no pre-existing wealth. Does that make sense?
No, it does. And I think your distinction between wealth inequality and income inequality is an important one. So thank you for breaking that down. You started to touch on on the next place that I wanted to go with that last comment. I was for one summer, most of my clinical training took place in a predominantly white community in the Mountain West. And then for one summer, I went out to Hawaii, on the North Shore of Hawaii, and saw a population of clients that was so different than the ones I had worked with historically. They were from all over Oceania, the Pacific Islands, and large parts of Asia and Hawaii. And it was incredible to me how culturally inappropriate my previous bag of tricks had been. Like, the things that I was using to counsel with people that looked like me oftentimes just plain out didn't work. And other times were absolutely contraindicated. Like, they were 180 degrees of what I should have been doing with this person that was sitting in front of me. From a giving good advice standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, what cultural differences and attitudes towards money, risk, and investing should non-Black practitioners be aware of when working with Black clientele?
I would say that it's helpful to meet them where they are and understand that a lot of clients, I would treat it the way that you would working with a family who is first generation successful, quote unquote. But even then, understand that you might have to go a step further. So one of the ways is, and this is probably part of my background and my understanding coming from the community that I come from. So being a Black advisor, I'm used to asking all of my clients what their money history is and what's the state of their family and friends financially beyond their household. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One, it's just helpful to understand their kind of psychology and outlook. But then two, from a material standpoint, in the Black community, and that can be African-American, that can also be very heavily in the African and Caribbean communities, it is not uncommon for a breadwinner to be supporting multiple households, to be sending money to parents or siblings or extended family, or for the sort of social expectation for them to be at the ready for a financial favor. And for that reason, I have this saying that white wealth is linear. It moves in a very linear, logical way. Like you would suspect that parents would leave money to children or send money to children. The wealth flows downhill. And conversely, Black wealth tends to radiate. So it's like there's one center, maybe two inside of a family that have become successful, and then that person ends up kind of bearing the load for people that are not in that household, which puts a strain on the new dollars that come into the household because they don't serve the kind of primary purpose that we think of for those extra dollars. I mentioned utility versus discernment. Well, a lot of these households are not just serving their own utility, they're serving the utility of 2 or 3 other households. So the income power of those dollars is being stretched to its thinnest degree before we can even talk about what the smartest investment is going to be for you at this time. And so understanding that, but also not trivializing it, is important as an advisor. You really have to go the extra mile to make sure that you respect and honor their perceived responsibility. Because for some people, it might be easy to say, well, that's, your parents had their chance, they're adults, your siblings are adults, whatever the case may be, their kids aren't your kids. But from a culture and value standpoint, that's not really an easy conversation to shove to the side. And you need to be sure to understand what type of person you're dealing with as an advisor and how important that is to them, because the advice that you give needs to take it into account. And that's something that I've learned in my experience. And some of that is intuitive, but a lot of it is also through experience, just working with people over the years and recognizing, we may have some recommendations and on paper when we're looking at your budget, if we don't account for kind of the support ongoing or in one-offs, then there's a chance that our plan is going to get interrupted.
I'm glad you brought up the example that you did. We did research at Orion a while back that culminated in the development of our BFI 20 tool, but we interviewed hundreds of folks and we tried to discern, we entered without any sort of preconception about what the right number would be, but we wanted to discern like a handful of different variables along which people of different walks of life differ. And we found 5. There was only one that had a cultural and a gender-based dimension. And it was this sort of individualistic versus collectivistic mentality with a linearity versus radiance. I actually really like the terms that you used. And what we found is that white Western folks tended to have this linear approach that you're talking about, right? Like, this is my money. I made this money. I put my own air, my own oxygen mask on first. I'm going to take care of me. I'm going to do me. And then I'll provide for the people sort of in my direct chain of command, right? Mm-hmm. Chain of command below me. We found among women to some degree, and among non-white, non-Western folks to an even larger degree, this collectivistic idea that if grandma needs help with the light bill, then that's on me, right? If my nephew needs help paying for college, then that's also on me. And I think, in an industry, what we found across all 5 of these continua was, first of all, a fish doesn't know that it's wet, right? Like, however, I grew up, and I definitely grew up in this linear, put on your own mask first mentality. To someone like me who grew up with that being the expectation, doing otherwise seems crazy. And, coming from the other side, when you grow up with this radiance mentality, doing it the way that I do it seems selfish and inhumane, right? When I lived in the Philippines, they would say like, oh, you're American. And the first thing they would say is, I can't believe you send your old folks to homes. Like this, this is this was their understanding of American cultural values, is like, you don't honor your elders. When people become inconvenient to you, you put them away. And like that to them was monstrous. And I think to a lot of Americans, that's just like, oh, well, grandma needs help. We're going to put her in assisted living now. Well, that's not my, it's no longer my concern kind of thing. And so I love what you said about understanding, taking a step back, not assuming the way that you've done it is the only way that it can ever be done, and honoring and understanding that person's worldview and their approach, I think is critical.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's what it comes down to really, it is connecting at that human level. It, quite frankly, over the years, similar to all of the conversation that we've been having, right? The other byproduct of that is there is a lack of overall engagement from the Black community and the financial services industry. Part of that is historically there's kind of restrictive barriers. There's a lack of community experience, and there's also a lack of trust. And so if you can't take that extra step and really connect at that level, part of it is, quite frankly, our industry, as you know, historically has been old and white and male. And so sometimes it's hard just to find and work with or engage with someone who might understand you more strictly from a cultural competence standpoint, just taking that step. But then beyond that, life insurance companies used to put a cap on how large the death benefit could be on someone based on their race, for example. So there's a mistrust, and I just mentioned the lending and subprime lending issues. So there's a mistrust at an industry level from consumer to corporation, but then also at a practitioner level, it's not always easy to find someone who looks like you and that you can trust, but you also don't have within your family, you don't always have the evidence of, well, my mom worked with an advisor for years and it went great. You know what I mean? So you don't have the visual evidence, the experiential evidence of, I'm glad that my mom, my dad had this person. Now, that's not to say that it's non-existent. It's just not as common. And when you don't have that evidence, it's hard to engage with confidence any advisor or institution believing that they're going to have your best interest in mind.
It's when you start to dig into financial history, it gets awfully shady, awfully fast. You think it was, like you're talking about race-based caps on insurance. It was not until the late 70s that women could have a credit card without a man co-signing. I mean, there's been a lot of mistrust. What do we as an industry do to win some of that trust back? And is part of the answer education and outreach?
I do think that's very helpful. I think, by virtue of the world advancing, there's a certain amount of transparency that has become necessary. And I think it's becoming more and more necessary in many ways, just because there's so much information available to consumers that, someone who's in a position to market their services, there's not a whole lot that you can hide anyway, right? And so beyond that, I think education is really the key. I mean, even as a practitioner myself, I view my approach to giving people advice to arm them with the information. And then we typically will design a solution based around their preference, based on their understanding of the information. So I go in with the goal of, let me help clarify and explain the technicalities, right? Like, this is how this product works. This is how this strategy works. These are the pros and cons to it. This is why you might not. Give them the options and then help them discern, hey, this is my advice. Based on your situation, this is what I recommend that you do. Does that align with, do I accurately understand your situation, your objectives? And if not, we go back to the drawing board and we redraft a new recommendation, new solutions to the problem. And that process of educating and iterating on that education as we go tends to be very helpful. I think we have to do a better job of outreach. I'm very fortunate to be affiliated with a broker dealer that does a very good job of recruiting financial professionals based on the communities that they serve in, and then arming and equipping those professionals with the type of training and education that makes them worthy professionals of serving those communities. I think that's a fundamental aspect of access to advice and information, is if you show up in someone's community as a member of the community. And that's not to say that, someone who's white can't work with someone who's Black or vice versa, but it is a show of good faith that you are in and of the community and not just a stranger who's coming in to do business. And so education is important, but the engagement and how that education is deployed is really important as well.
Yeah, it strikes me, as you were explaining the way you do business, it strikes me of how 180 that is to how our industry as at large has operated historically. I mean, you're talking about this real education first empowerment model that's kind of work intensive, right? You've got to educate them around their different options. You've got to deepen their understanding, and then be their partner in taking a journey. Then they then select from among those options. I think historically we've operated from a disempowerment model, which is let me use all this jargon, let me, razzle dazzle you with all this confusing stuff, and then I can sell you the most expensive,
right,
expensive product off the shelf, and you don't need to understand this, I got it. Hopefully we're moving more in the direction of that empowerment model. Working for a fintech myself, I was put in mind of, the AI and technology and all these things, but I don't take for granted that it's going to be good. I think sometimes that technology can mitigate inequalities, and I think other times it can exacerbate it. When you think about fintech and the rise of fintech and digital financial platforms, do you see tech as a potential equalizer or exacerbator of the racial wealth gap?
I am, and hopefully I don't get into too much trouble for saying this, but I am not very confident that anything can actually be an equalizer of the racial wealth gap. And the main reason for that goes back to the top of our conversation, just about how the way that wealth progresses is not linear, it's compounding. And so anything that is going to also serve the acceleration of wealth for the white community, even if it does so for the Black community, that gap's not going to close. I do think that things can get better with the proper application of these technologies. And I think, as with everything, it really boils down to access and application. And if communities are given the proper access and can leverage these technologies properly, then I think it can improve their conditions. That's the way that I would put that. You're spot on in the sort of work intensive way. I mean, you mentioned technology, and you mentioned sort of the kind of flipping on its head of, trust me, I'm the professional, give me your information. I'll put it through this fancy software and I'll come back and be like, hey, do this and trust me because I'm a professional, right? But as opposed to leveraging my expertise as the advisor, I really want to make sure that our process is one where we come to a mutual understanding and we agree very explicitly on what our shared objective is through a planning engagement. Because when we do that, one, is just a better way to give advice, right? Like if I'm crystal clear on what it is that you're trying to accomplish, and you know that I know that, sort of the old joke, if you know that I know that you know, whatever, right? But that level of transparency, it makes the advice a lot stickier. It makes my clients much more likely to adhere to the plan years from now, which is really what you need in order to be successful in the long run in any financial plan. And using the technologies that are available to us today, there's so many that make that process a little easier, but it also calls for discernment for advisors in how we take and leverage that technology to administer our advice and share it with clients. And so for Black communities, I still think it comes down to their access and who and how they're being presented the advice and the impact that it's going to have.
You know, you mentioned discernment, and my final question will be one that I think requires some discernment. You know, one of the things that's always true, this is sort of a truism of human psychology writ large, is that differences within groups are larger on averages than differences between groups. So, you know, the differences in sort of wealth story, you know, between two Black people are going to be potentially incredibly varied, right? And you talked earlier about, you know, meeting them where they're at. And then at the same time, you know, with certain groups, we know that there are things that tend to be true. Like if you're working with a woman client, you know that on average they live longer than men, so there may be some longevity risk. You know that on average they are paid less than men, so there are some considerations there. You know that they tend on average to outlive their spouses, and on and on. But that may be true of a group, but it may not be true of any individual in particular. So if people who are listening to this, right, they have a new client tomorrow, right? Someone who walks in, what you called first generation successful. They may not have had, they may not be in line for inheritance. They may have, come from a family where the wealth may radiate, and they may have some demands. How would you think about, what questions would you ask? How would you proceed with that client, knowing these things in general, but still wanting to meet them where they're at and get their specifics?
For me, any new conversation with a client is the facts and figures are going to be what they are. But if we can't get below the surface on that, and I think I like to believe that any competent advisor understands this, but we've really got to get to the heart of the vision and the values, because you're absolutely right. Like, I've worked with Black families who are very much strict individualist, in the sense that, I'll take care of my kids, but I'm setting a very hard boundary about what I will and won't pay for, what I will and won't gift for, or they have very strict boundaries about whether or not they will help extended family. And they've done that on their own, oftentimes through experience, where maybe they were overly generous at some point and realized that, I like to say, like, when people are not spending their money, or when people perceive that you have more money than them, they perceive that as you have all the money. It's like, well, if you could help me with $5,000 here, why couldn't you help me with $10,000 there? You know what I mean? And so sometimes people will come to you with that lived experience already, and they've already put up the types of boundaries needed to stem that off, and they don't necessarily have the same type of need for you to assist them in that. But having the conversation to say, talk to me about your extended family. Talk to me about the people in your life that you feel responsible for, or that you like to be able to help. Tell me about the people that would be affected if something happened to you, and let them talk. I mean, that's, in my mind, that's Advisor 101. Like, make it open-ended and let them tell you, and build that relationship and comfortability. And if you do get any pushback, just let them know, we can work together, we can do a financial plan, but throughout your life, things are dynamic. And if there are people that are outside of your household that could have an impact on your financial plan, I want to make sure that we plan for those contingencies accordingly, right? So like there is a reason for it beyond just being nosy if people seem sensitive about it. But per usual, a big part of our relationship with our clients is asking for permission to go a little bit deeper. And I would suggest going into every relationship with the intent of going deep, because I mean, Daniel, as you know, in our industry, these are long-term relationships we're getting into, and it's business, but it's a very personal business, and we have to build that rapport and that comfortability. It's our responsibility to be able to do so, because I don't think that you can be an effective advisor if you don't. And that's very strongly held opinion of mine, but I'm sure a lot of people would agree with me. So it would be, for me, the advice would be just to be a lot more intentional about asking about what and who they feel responsible for, and giving them the space to let you know whether or not that's an issue.
Yeah, it's knowing the generalities, right? Like knowing the stats, I think points you in the direction of some open-ended questions you'd want to ask. But then you have to remain open-minded enough to listen to their actual answer without preconception. I think that's a beautifully balanced approach. Well, Adam, you have clearly put a ton of thought into this. You're an expert on the matter, and we're all better for having heard your wisdom today. As we close out, I'd invite you to share two types of resources with us. The first would be, where can people find out more about you and your work and follow you online? And then the second would be, are there books, websites, or other resources that you would point people towards if they want to learn more about the important topic we've discussed today?
Yeah, so you can find me at artisanfsonline.com. That's our business website. I am also on YouTube. So if you do adamtalksmoney.com, that'll be where you can find me there. And then resources. So there are a few books. One of my favorites is The Hidden Cost of Being African American: How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality by Thomas Shapiro. And the second is The Black Tax by Sean Rochester.
Adam, thank you very much. Check Adam out. Check the books out. Thank you again, sir. Look forward to seeing you at a Braves game soon.
Yes, sir. Sounds great. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.